Well, let's have a look at this sad looking shutter. See if we can figure out what's gone wrong and strip it down and clean it. So, off with the retainer ring, off with the rear group. We'll just have a quick look at this. It's very dusty on the inside, very dusty on the outside. A fingerprint on the back. I'm not admitting to anything, it might be my fingerprint. Right, off with the shims. Got a metal shim here and a couple of paper shims. Paper shims are a bit sticky with oil. That's the shims off, and you can see the shutter blades nice and clearly now. The front group, that was a bit stiff to remove. I think I'd noted that earlier when I was looking at this camera on a previous video. Missing a screw here. This screw, which does up the flash contact, just needs to give it a little bit of tension. It doesn't need to be screwed right in until it stops like that one has been. So we've only got 2 of the 3 screws at the back here. That one's most important. That stops the shutter from being able to rotate in the mount, keeps it firmly in position. I have trouble finding a replacement for that one because that's a little bit of an unusual screw, a bit thin, very small thread. Right, so start with the casting. What have we got? Oh, very nice. First thing I see, here's my flash contact. It's torn out of the back of the shutter. That's supposed to come off here, it's snapped right off. So I'm going to need a new shutter case to fix that most likely. That's a good start. Here's the curved pusher that pushes the cocking rack in here. Here's the curved rack that's driven by the camera and pushes on that pusher. The housing, uniformly filthy, a bit of corrosion here, lots of corrosion on the outside here. Look at the difference between the 2 sides, that's nice and clean. This side corroded as buggery, clear sign that it's been splashed. One lock screw on the front here locks the retainer ring. It's a very small screw, very easily lost. And like all things that are very easily lost, you can't get replacements because they've all been used by people who've lost them before you got there. Just unscrew this retainer ring, and I'm just using the stump of that cotton bud or Q-tip there to do that so that I don't scratch anything. Lift off the front plate here. This ring couples to the aperture settings on the shutter itself. As you can see, there's a fair bit of surface corrosion on that. All down to that splash, I would think. The same on this chrome ring, there's a bit of corrosion visible there. That'll clean off, that'll be okay. Here we've got the shutter speed cam plate. Now to the shutter itself. Zoom in a little bit more. I think that's still nice and clear. Right, what can we see? Well, it's uniformly dirty. An even shade of grey with fingerprints in it here and here. Those fingerprints have been there in a while, I would think. Oh, look at this. See the position of this rack here? That's incorrect. That is most certainly incorrect, and that's why the shutter was not going anywhere. With two teeth out, the shutter's partly cocked, and that's why it won't do anything. That should have been round there. I'll put the speed settings cam back on the front. We'll see if the shutter will now cock correctly. I'm not confident it will. Yep. Doesn't really want to close all the way. Because it's sticky, but yeah, at the higher speeds in particular, the shutter cocks and fires normally. So the shutter's sticky, certainly needs to be serviced, but that is not why it stopped. It stopped because somebody's been in and they've put this in the wrong position. It was two teeth out incorrectly. So that's interesting. You can take the curved cocking rack out, and this little bracket here, that holds the shutter in the cocked position. This isn't exactly staying in focus very well as it's chasing my fingers on it. That little bracket holds the stops you from being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter is not cocked. If it's missing, the shutter will otherwise work normally. So I'll remove the shutter release lever there. This is all pretty sticky, right? So I'm just going to remove this spring. This is the main drive spring, and in this case it's pretty tired. I'll see if I can find a better one. I don't have any good ones. In the old days when parts were available, that would have been replaced during a proper service. These days of course there are no parts. You do the best you can with what you've got. I'll remove the delay action. Yeah, it's got a very grey, even sort of a look to that. I wonder whether that's... It might be graphite powder. Someone may have puffed a bit of graphite powder in there, I suspect. And it's just stuck to the surfaces because the surfaces were probably slightly oily. Graphite powder's got its uses and it's got its places, but it's no good puffing graphite powder into greasy components because it'll stick and it'll bunch up in places you didn't want it. This is the retard gear train. Now, like that other part, the surface here is covered in graphite powder or something that looks like graphite powder. The whole shutter is really. It's as filthy as. So I'll just cock that and lift that spring over to unhook it so that it's not under tension. That spring was just very slightly loose. Not enough to cause a problem. If it had been any looser, it would have rattled loose completely, most likely, and jammed up the works. It was just tight enough to stay doing its job and no more. The moving flash contact. And here, I want to lift the spring out of there, unhook it from there. This is a bit tricky because it always wants to follow you as you put the lever, follows you as you pull the spring across, and so you don't end up being able to unhook it very easily. That's better. And I just stop that lever from moving by putting a screwdriver behind it. There's the pallet wheel for the flash sink. Starting to look a little bit more stripped down now. This screw holds the return spring for the flash sink self-timer setting lever, and it also holds the B lever in position. The B lever's job, of course, is to hold the shutter open while you're holding your finger on the shutter release button, when you have the shutter speed set to B. And in all other cases, I'll remove that spring. That was the return spring for the B lever. There's one other fine spring here which is easily lost, and it sits here between this lever and this lever. So I'm holding a pair of tweezers over the shaft so that the spring can't get away, because otherwise it will go for it. Get that spring out. That spring is very, very fine. I'll put it on a pair of tweezers there, you can just about see it. Yeah, that one there. That's the top of the shutter stripped down. Now I've got to flip it over and do the bottom of the shutter, or the back of the shutter. Just had to hunt high and low for my very important high-tech block of wood that I favour for working on things with. Right, flip this shutter over. 3 screws at the back hold the aperture setting lever in place. I'll see if I can solder that flash contact, because I may not have a suitable case for the shutter. I'll have to check. This is a bit oily more than anything else. Not uncommon. This space, this shim that goes between the two, that's very oily. And then this lever sets the self timer or the flash sync. You're changing between X and M flash sync. Right, so here we have the back of the shutter case. This is a dirty, greasy mess. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate into the shutter case. Before I take those out, I'll just see how, put those back, I'll just check and see how free that mechanism ran, because the shutter blades were exceptionally reluctant to move. Let's see. Flip that back, that back. Yeah, that's very, very stiff and sticky. So that's gummy with old grease, or alternatively, no, it's unlikely in this case, the shutter case may be slightly crushed from drop damage, and in which case there's just too much friction because of the reduced space. But that's be very uncommon with a folding camera. That's more something for a rigid fronted camera. Right, so we can lift off the shutter case. Here's our mechanism plate. Now, there's a lot of stuff here. Graphite powder. Heaps of it. So someone has been putting graphite powder into the shutter. And the case itself is absolutely filthy. This is corrosion. These dirty marks around here, that's corrosion. It should look shiny as it does on this side of the case. Yeah, a lot of dust just dropped out. I'm just checking, see what that moves relatively freely. That's good. Let's get this off here. 3 screws hold the retainer plate. Took the contents out. And all of these parts I'll have to clean carefully. You can see that that graphite powder is just loose in there. And here's where the flash contact is broken off the back. Now, how did that come to be broken? Well, I know that the screw in the shutter case here, in fact I said that before I took it apart, that screw was done up too tight. I would suspect, they will never prove it, that screw had been done up too tight, and it had been left done up too tight, and someone had pulled the back of the shutter off without loosening it at all and pulled the contact off with it at the same time. I suspect that's what's happened, but I'm never going to know. So I'll look and see if I've got another case. If I've got another case, I'll use it. Otherwise, I've got to see if I can solder that contact back in position. It's snapped off down in there in the plastic. I can see the top of it. I can possibly get that to solder. We shall see. I mean, it may be that the owner of this particular camera has no need to use an electronic flash or any sort of flash with the camera, but they need to, everything really should work if at all possible. Let's pop those parts to one side. Look at the mechanism plate. The mechanism plate, we've got our shutter blades here, and I'm looking at those to see if they are in the correct position. Yes, they are. That should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the blades are correctly placed, and that's okay. Not that it makes a hell of a lot of difference there. And they do tip out nice and easily. Now the blades are not overly oily. It might have been expected that those blades would be oily and stuck together. They don't seem to be too bad. The mechanism plate. Yeah, it's definitely sticky. That certainly needs to be stripped and cleaned. 3 screws on the mechanism plate. One of them holds the bracket for the main spring, and that has the longer of the 3 screws. The other 2 screws are the same, look much the same, they're slightly shorter. And it's important that you don't mix them up, because if you put a short screw where the long screw should be, it will only be only just engaged with the threads in the mechanism plate. And when you do it up, likely you'll strip them out. And if you put a long screw where the short screw should be, it will stick through the mechanism plate and it'll foul the blades. So this is the blade actuating ring. This is the piece that swings the blades inwards and outwards. And I'm looking at the state of this. It's quite dirty, of course. The mechanism plate's quite dirty. It's probably got grease on it here, graphite grease possibly, or it might just be an excessive build-up of that graphite powder and a bit of oil as well. Doesn't look too bad. I think that'll clean up. And the lens tube which holds it all together, it's a bit scruffy looking, but it's not corroded or anything. That looks fine. So these components need to be cleaned one after another and then reassembled. But I'm going to first inspect my supplies of shutter parts and see if I've got a case that matches. Now you'd think that all the shutters on Retina IIIc cameras should be the same, but they're not. They often differ in slight features. there's a couple of bosses on the back of the mechanism plate, and in some cameras they extend out through the back of the plate. They're just raised, and there's a clearance hole in the back of the plate for them. And in other shutters they're not. So you just need to get parts that match. Of course this case is not a good example anyway because of this corrosion, which I'm just rubbing away at with my tip of my tweezers there, and that oxidised crap is coming away. I'll see what I can find. Well, the hunt for a replacement shutter body was not successful. I just don't have one the same. So I'm going to have to work with what I've got. My first task is to scrape out this corrosion rubbish here. Clean all the traces of oil. You can see how oily this is. Clear all that oil and rubbish off there. Make sure that everything is clean and tidy. And then see if I can solder a contact back on here for the flash. Certainly I can push the contact down inside that plastic, and I might need a longer contact that I might be able to scavenge off something else. So I've got a whole longer piece and push it down in there. And I do have some conductive glue somewhere, because if I try and solder that, the plastic insulator will just get mutilated. See, that's all of a piece with that plastic insulator, and that's riveted to the shutter casing. But a conductive glue might well work. Anyway, I want to clean this case up first, so let's just have a little scrape at that corrosion and see if it comes away. It'll just be a powdery deposit of various oxides, I'd say. I'm just using the side of the screwdriver tip here to rub that rubbish away. I don't want to dig into the aluminium housing at all. I think that'll do. Just run along the top edge here. That seems fine. Right, so clean this. Well, I'll use some naphtha on a cotton bud. There's a tui outside the window. I can hear it singing. It's gone quiet now. Very unusual, the staining on the back of this shutter. odd discoloration. It's someone's been at this with paint. That's what a lot of the discoloration is. It's paint. If you look at the shutter body here, it's got quite a gloss finish at this point, and it immediately fades into matte finish. And someone has painted this, and that paint is running underneath here. And at what stage they did that is anyone's guess. So I'll have to use some acetone and get this completely clean. Perhaps, yeah, it's not good. Well, here's the shutter case and the outer case. They would normally fit together like that. Now you can see that this terrible corrosion here on the outside of the outer case lines up exactly with the corrosion on the inner case here. And this is, I've cleaned this with acetone. It's lifted off all that extra paint that had been used to cover that up. And basically it had been used to cover that corrosion up. The corrosion wasn't removed and then it was painted. It was painted over the top of that corrosion. So I'm going to have to rub this case right back and spray it with some black paint to put that black back in place. I'm not sure what was used exactly. A lot of that paint has come off the back of the shutter fine using acetone, but not all of it. But anyway, I'm going to need to clean this case and respray it. The inner side of the case here, you can see the corrosion marks are still present, but they're not going to cause any problem. Well, I've got my shutter case masked now and cleaned up. I'll spray that with some black paint and move on from there.